What would William Blake have to say about the so-called hard problem? The question of how consciousness emerges from the brain, how mind is connected to meat. What would he have to say about the tendency to reduce us or model us, we human beings, as if we were machines, to reduce thought to neurochemistry, or to reduce his vision to a diagnosis, as is quite common even in Blake studies nowadays? What would he have to say about human beings in the 21st century imagining that our future lies in the metaverse, or our best hope is to be uploaded into the cloud? The reason why I like Blake on these questions is that he was a thinker, but he was also a poet and an artist. And so it's not just that he does the analysis, but that he offers the punchy sayings, the provocative thoughts, the imagery that makes us feel our humanity, not just feel we have to kind of tackle the complicated questions about the nature of consciousness and go down the rabbit holes of technical terms. When you can feel it, when you know it, that's where liberty lies, not just when you've worked it out as a problem. And so I quite like reading William Blake alongside the contemporary philosopher David Bentley Hart, who's very brilliant at analysing these problems, but can be quite a hard read. And so part of my thoughts now is to use William Blake to show, as much as tell, how we can forge a response to these questions which seem to be so dominant today. So I've taken 5 sayings of Blake, some well known, some slightly less well known, to unpack some of these themes. And the first one is this: how do you know but every bird that cuts the airy way is an immense world of delight closed by your senses 5? How do you know but every bird that cuts the airy way is an immense world of delight closed by your senses 5? The swooping bird in this image speaks to us of swoops of delight, riding the air like a spirit, rising up like a soul. So we see the bird with our senses, but sense as well, quite spontaneously, an immense world that the bird and its flight channels and connects us to. It's an experience that speaks of how there's no body and then a kind of ghost in the machine, or for that matter, there's no spirit trapped in a body. This is the foolishness of dualisms, Blake stressed. You can't actually separate mind and body. You can't separate the bird flying and the immense world of delight. Not even conceptually, actually, like you can separate hardware and software conceptually. Blake knew, and this is an important critique now, that minds inhere in organisms. We don't know of minds existing anywhere else, and my bet is we never will discover minds existing anywhere except in something that can be called an organism, because it's about the brain, yes, but it's also about the body and the body's functions, the heart, the gut, its mobility. It's also about our histories, personal histories of love and longing and loss. Our mind body inherence is about our context of time and place as well. You know, when we live, how we live, who we live, where we live. It's about our developmental achievements, as the psychologists would say. But where achieving here is that which makes for our development. It's the process which helps us to flourish, that releases our potential, that makes us persons across time. And it's about our future hopes and desires too, of course, the pull from what might come as much as the presence of the past. It's why there is such a thing as human beings that we quite spontaneously treat as sacred. And when human beings aren't treated as sacred, but say are treated as machines, it causes offence. I was recently watching a programme on the television with some archaeologists digging up a medieval graveyard, and it was stressed how much care is taken to rebury the skulls and bones, unlike the pots and arrowheads or swords that were discovered as well, which are just put into storage. And this business of treating us as human beings that are connected not just within ourselves but without ourselves too, to our time and place, to others, to relationships. This is actually why Blake is one of the Christians who have stressed that all must be saved. He realised that to be a person is to need all people to be in the presence of God. And if some people were cut off from that, you could not be a full person, and so couldn't be fully present to the divine either. No one is saved, you might say, until everybody is saved, because everybody in some measure or other is connected. That's part of what it means to be a body, mind, community, place, universe, entity. There's no point where one bit stops and another bit starts, as you can conceptualize, say, with hardware and software. This is the Platonic view, in fact, properly understood. And Blake was aware in his own time that Plato was already being misused, and that misuse of Plato, as if Plato as some kind of dualist, has only continued into the modern world now. But Plato too, who didn't even have the word dualism, knew that body and mind aren't separable, but rather the body is an expression or a localization of a soul. It gives it a place, as well as that transcending of place that we know. And the body is not animated by a soul, but is a reflection of divine form. Blake talks a lot about the human body being the divine imagination, and that's partly what he means. The soul is the principle of life, as well as the subject of experience or our own individual thought. It constantly connects out, which is why when we see the bird flying through the air, we feel that expansiveness. How do you know? But every bird that cuts the airy way is an immense world of delight, closed by your senses 5. So what happens when that's denied? And this can be captured in perhaps Blake's best known phrase of dark satanic mills. To have that denied is to live among those dark satanic mills. What Blake's saying is that there's no life in machines. He would immediately appreciate that the funny thing, in fact, is that even machines aren't like what people often say of them now. Computers, for example, don't actually compute, as David Bentley Hart has said, because computation is a meaningful act. It has a sense of something that's sought. It has a telos, an end in mind. Rather, what we call a computer depends upon the mind that's made it and wants the computer to compute. It has an outside-in relationship with the world around it. Perhaps it's to find a list of the prime numbers, but of course the computer has no sense of prime numbers, or even what the pixels on the screen that are a list of prime numbers to us are conveying to the mind that looks on. You can go so far as to say there's not even a single word in a word processor, or a word processor is not really a word processor. Rather, it's a string of operations that we human beings, as the mind using the computer, use to process words. We're the processor, enabled by the tool called the computer. And to confuse the two is a bit like confusing the ink and paper and binding of a book with the contents of the book. It's a bit like buying the book, sitting it on your shelf, and then feeling you've got all that the book can offer. The mind must engage with the book in order to bring out the meaning. Similarly, the mind is what makes sense of the computational abilities of the computer. Which is also to say, in a way, that thought is not like processing data. If thought that goes on inside us were like data processing, then it would just be a linear question. As long as you put the time in, you could think all thoughts. Clearly that's not the case. Or more punctually, it's perhaps a bit like saying that a computer might gain if occasionally it was to go for a walk or get a breath of fresh air or sleep on the problem with which it's wrestling. Clearly that won't help the computer. But going for a walk, taking a breath of fresh air, sleeping on it helps us realise things. It's because we're not machines. So similarly, when it comes to the fantasy of uploading into a metaverse or a cloud, it shows what a poor vision of life that actually is. It shows an age that is living amongst the dark satanic mills. As David Bentley Hart says, in a simulated world, only simulated selves could exist. And to think otherwise is a bit like saying, I want to play Minecraft to build a flesh and blood person. It just can't happen. Or it's as incongruous, I don't know, as hearing that Jesus shops at Harrods. Somehow the two things just don't really go together. It's a category error, as the philosophers say. It also reveals the mistake that it's wrong to ask what the world is made of, as if that's the most important question about the world, as if by knowing what it's made of we will discover the truth of things and discover reality. It's actually to get it completely the wrong way round. And the question is not what the world's made of, but whether anyone's at home in this world. And when you knock on the door, as it were, of another person, whether you discover a vitality and a soul there. What this added up to for Blake is that Bacon, Newton and Locke, the three philosophers that he identifies with the mechanical philosophy, need to join hands with Milton, Shakespeare and Chaucer, those poets who live in Jerusalem rather than amongst the dark satanic mills. And then the insights of Bacon, Newton and Locke can relate to reality properly rather than trying to build realities of their own, which are no realities at all. So this takes us back to the question of who we are, what being a person actually means. And Blake is very helpful on this front as well. One quote that can be illuminating is this very early reflection from Blake when he wrote, "If it were not for the poetic or prophetic character, the philosophic and experimental would soon be at the ratio of all things and stand still, unable to do other than repeat the same dull round over again. If it were not for the poetic and prophetic character, the philosophic and experimental would soon be at the ratio of all things and stand still, unable to do other than repeat the same dull round over again." People, Blake is saying, have a poetic and prophetic character, meaning that they respond to their lives and times and make something of their lives and times. And moreover, we do that imaginatively, not just rationally and empirically. The rational and empirical actually not just serve the imagination, but need the imagination and the intuition to even get going. And so this all takes you into a consideration of what it is to be a person. Perhaps the core thing to try and hold on to in these debates about the mechanical future offered to us. It begins with a sense of being an I, having a self, having an identity. And of course, if you take the I, the self, or that identity away from someone, they simply fall apart. It's about having a unique perspective, which can never quite be replicated in another. Unlike a machine, of course, that can be reproduced indefinitely and do exactly the same thing time after time, that reliability is why machines are valuable. You only need to look at the difference, say, between the variety of faces in a phone shop or a computer shop and see the inner lives expressed in those many faces, and then realize that the phones or computers in the phone computer shop have just come off a production line, are as many million identical iPhones. We are not like them. More subtly, but in a way very fascinatingly too, is that unlike a cog in a machine or a chip on a silicon board that must be fitted tightly with no space in order to work and so be properly joined up, we human beings, like the sense of connection, need the sense of connection, but also need a sense of separation and distance. We need space as well as contact in order to function. And this is also partly why a rich inner life is one that's partly known to you, one that partly connects with you, but also is unknown to you. You know, whether that be your own inner life or the inner life of someone else. You don't want your beloved, your friend, to be completely transparent to you, because otherwise there'd be nothing more to discover. There'd be no sense of depth. It's also to say that experiences have this expansive, open quality. An experience like childhood can be given the name childhood, but then there'd be an almost infinite amount of things you might say even about your own childhood. It would lead you constantly into new highways and byways. That's something about this connectedness and separation, about being known but also unknown. Whereas, of course, a machine must be pinned down. It must be known how it's going to respond in every respect in order to be useful as a machine. Another difference between machines and persons is that we can follow rules, but also know when to break them. And we know when to break rules because you might say it makes sense to us to break the rule then. Now, a machine can have no sense of when to break the rule. An algorithm's an algorithm, it follows the rules all the time. But we break rules all the time in sensible ways, perhaps to make a joke, perhaps to be naughty, perhaps because we're seeking for a sense of justice that's higher than just the bureaucracy of the law. Of course, knowing when to break rules produces a J.S. Bach, who uses intuition and imagination, not just imitation, in order to make music. It's why, in fact, some physicists even are concerned that the computationalization of physics, as if the best science is now done by algorithms on computers, is leading physics and science itself to get trapped in a dull round and not produce new insights that might make for more and better science. A mechanized science can't produce an Albert Einstein, you might say. And some are even wondering whether that's why there's been no Einstein, since computational power so took over much of the scientific enterprise. This is all to say that we human beings have an openness to novelty. Human development is totally different from the development of a machine. We don't just get faster and cheaper and more efficient as we change. In fact, we might well get slower, more expensive and less efficient as we move from being a child into an adult. But we would say we mature, we become more fulfilled, we become wiser. Blake would go so far as to say that we who dwell on earth can do nothing of ourselves. Everything is conducted by spirits, no less than digestion or sleep. We're connected to wider dimensions of reality, and when we know our sense of place within that wider context, we feel like we become more and more human. The business of connection and separation being crucial there. And so this novelty, this expansiveness, this sense of having poetic and prophetic character, not just philosophic and experimental. This sense of the infinite, you might say, leads to a fourth saying, which I think is really helpful. And that is Blake's comment that there is no natural religion. Now, Blake meant a couple of things by this. One is that religion can't emerge from within human evolution, as if it's a social phenomena designed to bind us together, or an accidental product of our fears of the world around us that we then tell in stories of spirits and ghosts. He's also saying that religion can't be a way simply of bonding people, as if what's important about we human beings is being in networks, webs of relationships all the way down. Machines are enclosed webs of parts in proper relationship. Human beings are relational, but in a more open and expansive way that reaches out. You can put it like this, if you imagine your brain to be just a complex relationship of neurons, that's what leads to the fantasy that you could be uploaded on the cloud, because you might say that each neuron could be replaced by a chip one by one, and as long as the simulation of the neuron was accurate enough, you would gradually turn into a web of silicon chips rather than a web of neurons, or as it's theorized in another machine version of the human, it's imagined that we are abstract information processors or abstract information transferers detecting patterns, and that's what gives us our subjectivity. But similarly, that's a closed image of what it is to be human, not the open experience that we actually have. It's the fantasy that if you could make a computer complex enough, it would somehow wake up. But as another great thinker on these things, Bernardo Kastrup, is fond of saying, that's a bit like saying if you built a model in a computer of a kidney, your computer would start to pee. It's a common mistake quite widely in the world. It leads to wide elephants, such as, the Millennium Dome, and expecting the Millennium Dome to conjure up the spirit of confidence over cynicism, boldness over blandness, excellence over mediocrity, whatever it was that it was hoped just building this Millennium Dome would release at the turn of the millennium, and of course it fell flat. You need to be connected to the spirit that the material is then a manifestation of, not just think that by conjuring up the material form the spirit will show up. This business about there's no natural religion is also why Blake never joined a church, or at least he joined one momentarily, the Swedenborgian church, and then immediately left it. And as he put it in one of his best known poems, I went to the garden of love and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst, where I used to play on the green, and the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not written o'er the door. So I turned to the garden of love that so many sweet flowers bore, and I saw it was filled with graves and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires. The garden of love is the open world of human persons energized by love, not energized by steam or electricity, not bound closely together with briars, but full of releasing joys and desires. It's an organic vision of what it is to be a person, a whole vision of what it is to be a person, not mechanical and capable of being broken down into parts. The deeper truth that you immediately know, because it's why, for example, it's so offensive were you to say to somebody whose partner has died, oh well, you can just get another partner. We're not replaceable like machines are replaceable. We're not bound together by religion to sort of hold us in some sort of connection, but rather religion in its multiple forms arises because We long to reach out imaginatively, intuitively, into the garden of love and be free to follow the ways of the Spirit, not the dictates of the law. So what's it to have this awareness? And for this, move on to the fifth saying, a bit better known. He who binds to himself the joy does the winged life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. This is as close perhaps as Blake gets to a creed. He who binds to himself the joy does the winged life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. But it's a way of life rather than a diktat. It's saying that for we human beings, another whole facet of what it is to have a decent life matters, that machines have absolutely no part in at all, and it's the business of intentionality or teleology, ends that matter. Everything we do is for an end. Even going to the shop is for an end, unlike a machine that has no ends of its own, only ends which are given to it by us. Take a car, also known as an automobile, as if it can move by itself, which of course it can't. It can neither move by itself along the street, or even with fully automated cars, it will still need us to tell it where to go. The automobile is one of the great misnomers of the modern world. Similarly, a car can't think, I'd like to be a plane, whereas people routinely dream of flying. But this intentionality and teleology go a lot further than that. It's not just fanciful. It's about being concerned for values, for what's good, beautiful and true. Now, a machine doesn't know what values are. It doesn't even have what it would take to know what values are. So for example, a machine might link a lovely red to the wavelength of light at about 700 nanometers, but it would have no sense of the redness of red, or even the ability to have that sense. It's related to this business about thought as well, and how it's not like processing data. So language is not like processing code, because for us the edge of words matter as much as the clarity and precision of words. We need that both and. You take a very common phrase like I love you. If it weren't for the edge of that phrase around which the personal connection can find expression, I love you would become one of the most banal and meaningless things you could say to someone else, because it's said so often, whereas of course it is actually one of the richest and most meaningful things you say to somebody, because of the edge of the words and what exceeds and is excessive in that phrase. Differently, but in the same kind of sense of openness, we human beings don't want to just produce results like a machine is designed to. We want to be appreciated, we want to be rewarded, and without that sense of connecting what we do in little ways and bigger ways to what's good, beautiful and true, life becomes unlivable. We fall into depression or spiral out of control. We indulge violence, perhaps, in order to try and create a sense of something that's meaningful, force it into our lives. Perverse substitutes for that which can draw us towards greater things. But it doesn't just stop there, because the good, the beautiful and the true is not just a kind of private obsession or preoccupation. The minute you start to think about it, it is shared. The good, the beautiful and the true comes to us, and that's why it's so tremendous and desirable and wonderful. It's in the cosmos, in the spirited immense world of delight that the bird swoops through, as much as it's in our heads. You might say that meaning comes from the top down, not the bottom up. It's discovered, not made. Thinking otherwise than that is a bit like saying that the tubes of oil paint are as important as the picture by Van Gogh. And mind too is top down and not bottom up. Blake would realise that mind, much like meaning, can't emerge because meaning and minds are so intimately connected, or be built from smaller units of consciousness like panpsychism envisages. That is a bottom up approach rather than the top down reaching out approach. Our minds reflect something that already exists and become more fully formed the more that they reflect that. It's a bit like language. Part of the trouble why it's so hard to come up with a theory of the evolution of language is that language already requires formed networks of meaning within which the semantics make sense, the syntax can find form. And put in an everyday experience, we reach out to discover, to understand, to appreciate, to amplify, to diversify. And when we find ourselves falling into the dull round, understanding, discovery, joy, appreciation, and so on are disappearing from us, we seek to reflect or manifest, to mirror or embody, where the finite reaching to the infinite, the temporal in love with the eternal. Eternity is in love with the productions of time, though Blake added, because the infinite and the eternal reach to us, fill us as well. We come to know because we want to know and know there's always more to know, and that always more to know continually gives to us to fulfill our desire to know. It's why images like the sun radiating its light and life on all equally come to mind. All we have to do is turn to the sun to receive it, and similarly the effort to know and find meaning is to turn towards that which gives meaning. It's also why desire is part of knowing and meaning. Desire and intelligibility go together. You have to yearn it, want for these things, which of course no machine needs, no machine desires, much as no machine really knows. You might say that to have an intellect is to have a will, and that will is preoccupied with the good, the beautiful, and the true. It's not just about keeping going or performing tasks. We need to have a direction of travel which is beyond what we know already, beyond our finite lives. And a society that denies this openness, this connection with the eternal and the infinite, is one that risks going into decline, into decadence, or maybe consuming itself and eating the world that it feels is around and it can possess and control, because it's forgotten that there's much more than just the world that it sees with its eyes closed. Putting it more positively, it's why a rich life is one that wants to be dazzled by life, wants to try and gaze into the sun, have the experience of wonder, rather than being imprisoned in the cave of shadows. It's why people climb mountains, because they're there, or why they speculate about the Riemann hypothesis, because it exists. It's why people, I think, ultimately don't prefer to live in a safe artificial world, although if you offer them that, at first they might say yes, but prefer to live in the wild with contact towards the sublime. They want to fall in love, for example, which is a wild, precarious thing to do, not a safe artificial thing to do. They want to go and listen to the bird song as it cuts the airy way and wonder what that might be about, never quite knowing in its entirety. That openness is why the fullness of life is discovered too by letting go of your life. We strangely find more life when we step outside of our immediate lives. The sense of dying to the smaller self in order to be born in contact with the wider sense of self. That too is caught in this wonderful fifth expression of William Blake. He who binds to himself the joy does the winged life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies, lives in eternity's sunrise. So to bring things to some sort of summary, having moved across the face of these thoughts of Blake, like moving across the face of waters, the first phrase was, how do you know that every bird that cuts the airy way is an immense world of delight, closed by your senses five? We are manifestations of the divine vision. The second phrase was about living amongst the dark satanic mills when that's denied, treating the divine vision as if it were a phantasm of an overheated brain, as Blake also puts it. But thirdly, keep reflecting on what it actually means to be a person, Blake advises. If it were not for the poetic and prophetic character, the philosophic and experimental would soon be at the ratio of all things and stand still, unable to do other than repeat the same dowel round over again. Contemplate the nature of imagination and intuition which you have. See how your mind fits with the minds of others and the world around, not tightly like cogs in a machine, but expansively, with this wonderful mix of the known and the unknown, of space and separation. The edge of words matter as much as the precision of words. So fourthly, we don't live in a closed up mentality, as if everything was just in your skull or everything was just a product of the struggle to survive in evolution. Religion is not a way of bonding people. It's a way of grounding us in traditions that open towards the infinite and the eternal. And similarly, we're not just a complex network of relationships or patterns of information exchanged. Those things no doubt exist, but they're in service of the more too. Openness to novelty is a crucial part of what makes us human, not machines as well. And fifthly, it's that expansiveness, that orientation to the more, which makes for our lives, in little ways and big ways. He who binds to himself the joy does the winged life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. It's not just that we long for what's good, beautiful and true, but when you think about it, that can only be the case because the good, beautiful and true longs to be known by us. And that, I think, is the ultimate realization of Blake, which makes him a theistic prophet, a theistic poet. He knows that the imagination connects to the divine. He knows that intuition is part of the inside of all things, and the divine wants to connect with us even more than we want to connect with it.